Welcome to tonight's Sustainers Lecture for the museum's original exhibition, Paul Reed, A Retrospective. Our journey for this exhibition began about a decade ago when we included one of Paul's works, number 17, which is the subject of my pocket square and a few scarves around the auditorium. We included it in an exhibition, Matisse in His Time. Thank you, Karen. At that time, we were working with the Centre Pompidou, the largest modern art museum in Paris, in Europe, and they asked us to select 12 works from our collection that they would review for inclusion in the exhibition. And I'll tell you that the Paul Reed work was the number one work on our list. It was the one that we were confident that they were going to like. We thought this is a high enough quality work that it will be included in the Centre Pompidou exhibition. And sure enough, it was one of the four that they chose. It was the only American work in the exhibition. And at that time, we got to know Jean Reed Roberts, who's in our front row here tonight. And that kind of got the ball rolling. And it's culminating tonight. 9 years after that exhibition opened, after that exhibition opened with another exhibition that is original to this museum. So let me begin by thanking Jean Reed Roberts and her three children, Amy, Rebecca, and Nathaniel. Thank you so much. You've done so much throughout the process. Jean, first of all, for her generosity and her vision to make sure that her father's legacy that the world knew what kind of artist he really was, which you'll see tonight and you'll see in the galleries. Thank you to the whole family and Nathaniel in particular for all the work that you did to help us out to get this exhibition going. So starting there, but also I want to thank our team. We've been working on this for years. There are a number of people in the auditorium tonight, beginning with Maury Ford, who, if it wasn't for Maury and his work with the curatorial team at the National Gallery and other places, this wouldn't have happened. He worked so incredibly hard on this catalog and every aspect of the logistics of the exhibition. So thank you, Maury. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Jessica Provencher. Her vision for this exhibition, as you'll see it laid out in Randall Barnes' wonderful design. It really comes across. You'll see the story. You'll be able to kind of think alongside the artist. So we're very proud of that. Thank you to Trent Lawson and to the prep team for your incredible work. The exhibition looks beautiful. Ernesto Sanchez was along with us on the first trip, and he's back here as a supporter, a donor for the exhibition. So it's nice to see you and Lynn here tonight. So thank you to all of you, to the all of our departments at the museum. Everybody's put in so much hard work. So I'm just going to begin by thanking the museum's donors, and we've got a good list. So I certainly made sure to write it out, but let's begin by thanking the Ann Lacey Foundation and Chris Lawson for their support of the catalog. A beautiful publication. If you haven't gotten yours yet, it's available for sale in the store. Thank you, Chris, and your vision for that catalog. We do appreciate that greatly. Yes, thank you. Thank you to Annie Bohannon, Larry and Ronna Davis, Jim and Jennifer and Wineland, Lynn and Ernesto Sanchez again, Sodi and Robert Clemens, Jason Hammonds and Steve Cooter, retired Colonel Dean and Jeannie Jackson, Don and Carol Kasperite, Polly and Larry Nichols, Chip Oppenheim, Carolyn and Guy Patton, Amalia Miranda, Bob and Cindy Bernard, Jacqueline and Tim Burney, Terry Cooper, Karen Delaney, the Kerr Foundation, the James Gray Mead family, and Eric Salazar and Christopher Lloyd. Thank you all for your incredible support of this exhibition. Likewise, I would like to thank the exhibition's lenders. So we do have a collection of about 140 works by Paul Reed, but there are great works in other museums and other private collections that we wanted to make sure that this was the definitive exhibition of Reed's work. So there are a number of loans in the exhibition as well. So thank you to the American University Museum, Arizona State University Art Museum, David Butler, Carl and Marilyn Thoma, D. Wigmore Fine Art, Mark Ein, the Georgetown University Art Collection, Stephen Imler, Bill and Patty McGillicuddy, the National Gallery of Art, Bo Ott, Edward Peterson, who tragically passed away during our planning of the exhibition, the Phillips Collection, Jean Reed Roberts and her family again, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Will Stovall, Neil Subin, the University of Maryland Art Gallery, and the University of Maryland Global Campus. So thank you all to our amazing lenders to the show as well. Finally, I want to provide a very sincere thank you as I transition to the introduction to our curator, Dr. David Gariff, who is the senior lecturer at the National Gallery. David is a specialist in modern art, the history of art, and the art of the Italian Renaissance. And he has taught art history at the Catholic University of America, the University of Wisconsin, Cleveland State University, Trinity Washington University, and the University of Maryland College Park. David has held fellowships in Italy at the University of Florence, the University of Pisa, and the Institute for the History of Lombard Art in Milan. His lectures and writings, he has lectured, and written widely on topics related to modern art, film, and Italian culture. It is such a privilege for us to hear from David tonight on a topic that I think he's singularly qualified to speak to, and that's the art and legacy of Paul Reed. So please help me welcome David to the stage. We're just so lucky to have him for this exhibition and for our lecture this evening.
It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about the art of Paul Reed. Michael pretty much covered the territory about thanks, but I would also like to thank certainly everybody in the Reed family: Jean, Rebecca, Nathan, Amy. They were incredibly helpful, and we couldn't have done this exhibition without their support. And of course, I want to thank everybody here at the museum, Michael and Maury Ford, especially Maury. We were kind of married for 5 years. And then all of the museums and galleries that Michael already mentioned, who were kind enough to loan works to us. It's a big exhibition. When we were putting it together, because Paul was so prolific, and I should mention something about, you're not supposed to refer to an artist by his first name, but in this case, Paul was a friend of mine, so I can't call him. I find it difficult to say Reed did this and Reed did that, so I'm going to be referring to him as Paul. In any case, he was so prolific that when Maury and I and the staff here started to think about what would go into the exhibition, we started with about 260 works, which we whittled down over time to what's on view now. So let's kind of start the ball rolling here. So we start with where we are, of course, Oklahoma, the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, and you are a particularly important repository for the art of Paul Reed and the DC Color School. And so I'm showing you the galleries that I'm sure you've all have walked through and are familiar with. Works by, on the far left, Ellsworth Kelly, and then in the center, Sam Gilliam, and then Gene Davis on the right, and then you can see Paul Reed's painting of Step back in the corner there, which is in the exhibition. You did publish a beautiful catalog, Breaking the Mold, that was a discussion about this transference of the work from Washington to Oklahoma, and that's a very important publication. And then you, of course, did an exhibition in 2018 called The New Art, a Milestone Collection 50 years later at OKCMOA, and that was, again, a kind of celebration of this collection that you now are the stewards of and the caretakers for. But we're going to be talking specifically about Paul. I'm going to be giving a second lecture in a couple of days that will talk more generally about the history of the Washington, D.C. Color School. Tonight, this talk is going to be focused, just for the most part, on Paul. And here's the cover to our catalog, which is gorgeous. I hate to sound, I mean, I don't want to brag, but it is absolutely a gorgeous catalog. I'm very happy with the catalog. I enlisted 4 other writers to contribute chapters to the catalog, and they all wrote wonderful essays. So I would indeed sort of point you in the direction of looking at the catalog. This is Paul in his studio on the right, probably a photograph from the 1970s. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Paul's biography. He was born in Washington, D.C. in 1919. He went to high school at McKinley Technical High School in D.C., which, in fact, at that time, he was actually, his classmates were Gene Davis and Howard Marion. All three of them grew up together in D.C., and they went to the McKinley Technical High School. They became lifelong friends, but not without some bumps in the road along the way. Paul briefly attended San Diego State College, which is today, of course, San Diego State University. And then but he didn't stay very long. He left to pursue a career as a graphic designer in Washington, D.C., but also his work took him from Washington to Atlanta, to New Jersey, and to New York City. He married in 1939. He started a family right down here. And by 1952, he had settled in Virginia, Falls Church, Virginia. And really, that's when he started to turn his attention to painting. So he starts as a graphic designer, but slowly moves towards painting. So here's the earliest, one of the earliest works, if not the earliest, in the exhibition. It's his self-portrait on the right from 1938. It's ink on paper. And then another photograph from the 70s. Drawing was something that, for most artists, it's important, but it was particularly important for Paul. He was always drawing, taking many notes and sketches, doing many sketches. And of course, as a draftsman, that logically was part of his early training in working for advertising agencies and various newspapers and graphic design firms. So he was always drawing and always had a pencil, and I was always working. And in the self-portrait, which is, again, very early, it's really quite wonderful. It's the size of a sheet of notebook paper, not the size you see here. And he clearly is looking at himself in a mirror and trying to capture his likeness. There's a kind of, what shall we say? It's not arrogance, confidence. I think already in the portrait. So when he begins small scale. He's thinking about painting. It's the late 40s, but it's early 1950s. And of course, everybody in America is aware of the New York School and the abstract expressionism, everything that's happening in New York in the 40s and 50s. So Reed's early works sort of speak to the abstract expressionist tradition. This work on the left is called Alpha from 1952, and on the right is an untitled work from 1956, which you own here. And so you can see him looking at Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, certainly Franz Klein, all the New York artists. The painting on the left, which is small, and it's ink. I said it's ink on paper, but it's got several different colors. And the title, I think, is interesting because the title is Alpha, the first letter of the Greek alphabet. And I think in some ways this was Paul thinking about, okay, this is my first painting now in a new way of working. Not long after, once we get close into the 60s, throughout most of the 50s, when you go to the exhibition, the first couple of rooms sort of document the 50s and this kind of relationship to abstract expressionism. But it's in the 60s where Paul begins to find his voice, and this is painting on the left, number 16J from 1963, and number 21 on the right from 1964. He begins to create these all-over compositions, and he's interested in these biomorphic shapes. Paul was certainly aware of surrealism and the works by Jean Arp and Joan Miro, and he adopts this sort of petal-like biomorphic form. He certainly was aware of Matisse at this point, and especially Matisse's cutouts, which I'll show you in a second. The mandala form, of course, mandala is Sanskrit for circle, and the compositions are circular, although he cuts the corners. He cuts this one corner in the lower right with a triangular shape, and that's important, as are these four dots, because in his paintings, everything is calculated. And you have to understand, for example, that these 4 dots make a square within this petal motif compressed by this triangle that cuts this petal. This may be getting into the weeds, but when you look at Paul Reed's art, you have to look at everything that's on the page or the canvas because it's all very calculated and it's all very precise. This is clearly not a painting by Willem de Kooning. It's not loose, it's not painterly, it's a very controlled kind of language, and it's based on an artist who read widely in the history of art and was concerned with, especially in the Renaissance, basic theories, in fact, extending back to antiquity, like the golden section and certain relationships in geometry. So here's the painting that kind of started it all here, and this is a painting Michael was just referring to on the right that was in that exhibition. I'm comparing it to a painting that's owned by the Wigmore Gallery in New York City. And I should mention, in terms of thanks, Dee Wigmore, the Wigmore Gallery, and Emily Lentz, who I think is maybe somewhere here, have been tremendous supporters, advocates, protectors of Paul's work. If you happen to be in New York over the holidays, they very nicely, kindly kind of paralleled our exhibit here with their own exhibit, so kind of as like a satellite exhibit. We'll come back to that term, satellite. So here you see, these are acrylic, and I'll come talk about materials in a second. They're both from 1964. The Wigmore painting is smaller than the Oklahoma painting. And the Wigmore painting has the petals that don't touch the lower left triangle, whereas on the right, he cuts that petal with the triangle. And again, certainly the colors are incredibly beautiful, the relationships of colors, the color theory about complementary colors, etc., the geometry, but there's so much subtlety here that requires a certain amount of slow looking, as we like to say in the trade. And not just kind of whizzing by something to really understand what's going on. It's this circular mandala form here, but certainly the devil is in the details. His paintings deal with things like tension, forms that are in sort of conflicted but trying to resolve each other. Certainly compression, when he cuts edges and compresses something, makes it feel sort of tight. All of these things, spatial relationships, obviously, and color. So here's the catalog and the exhibition that kind of started it all here on the left. And this is, of course, the catalog for the exhibition in 1965 at the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. But importantly, that exhibition traveled widely throughout the United States. I don't have all the locations memorized, but it went to at least 5 or 6 other locations. So this brought the work of these artists to a much more broadly national audience. So the title of the exhibition was The Washington Color Painters. This was the catalog, and it ran from June 25th to September 5th, 1965. The painting on the right was in that exhibition. It's number 2B from 1965. And this was the exhibition curated by the director of the gallery at that time, Gerald Nordland. And it, in essence, sort of opened up the Washington Gallery of Modern Art. There were 8 works by Paul Reed in this exhibition. Number 2B, the one you're looking at on the right, is just a really rigid, beautiful, sophisticated, and very, very precise painting dealing with color theory, primary colors, secondary colors, warm colors, cool colors, what happens when you have complementary colors, as you know, are like blue and orange and red against green, yellow against violet. That creates high contrast. But when those colors start to overlap, then those colors will begin to change themselves, and sometimes they produce a more neutral kind of gray and brown. I was mentioning satellites, and this is a series of paintings by Paul Reed. The left this is the one that's in our exhibition, painting number 12 from 1963. This is from the Wigmore Gallery, again, with our thanks. And the painting on the right is also from the Wigmore Gallery. The painting on the left is satellite painting number 12 from 1963. And on the right is the painting Come Quad, Q-U-A-D, not Quat, Q-U-A-T. And that's actually important, from 1964. Again, acrylic paintings on canvas. Now, the satellite paintings are really wonderful because he's thinking about space and he's thinking about the wall. He's thinking about flatness, all these ideas that were percolating through the criticism at the time of people like Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg. I'm going to be talking about all those guys in my next talk. So he pulls out a piece of the sort of painting and has it exist as its own sort of satellite to the larger painting. So it has almost a kind of a jigsaw puzzle kind of feeling to it, that you pulled out a piece of a puzzle. And it creates interesting relationships in terms of flatness and color again. And then most importantly, and something he's going to be exploring later in the Gilport series, is what's between these two, which is nothing. And the space between these two images. Now, the kumquat is, I mean, if you had any doubt that Paul had been a great graphic designer, I mean, this should put that to rest, because it has that kind of precision, that kind of training that he had had earlier as a designer and as an illustrator. So I want to just mention the title, because the colors of this painting seem to refer to the fruit, to a kumquat, right? Orange. But the title is not kumquat. It's kumquad, quad, four-sided, cubic, having other relationships. Now, in this case, certainly this title was intentional. The spelling, I should say, of this title was intentional because it relates to the whole formal idea of the painting. There are, however, places where, I'm sorry to say, Paul just misspelled words. And so when one is trying to find, well, where is this place or whatnot? Well, it doesn't exist because he spelled it wrong. That's not the case here. That's not the case here. So here are Matisse cutouts at the National Gallery on the left. So those are our paintings, or our cutouts at the gallery. On the left, the large decoration with masks from 1953, their paper collage on canvas. And that's just one wall. If you come to the National Gallery, if we have these things out, they're very delicate and very light sensitive because they're colored paper. That wall is probably the size of this whole wall here in the front on the stage here. And then against Paul's painting, number 26C from 1964. And you can certainly see, especially in that kind of petal-like form, and then the relationships, again, to the triangles, to the feel of color. There are a lot of ratios. I'm not going to go through all of these mathematical ratios here, but he is calculating certain relationships, horizontal to vertical, circle to triangle, et cetera. The cubic form, those four dots, are actually very important to him because he thinks a lot about whether that cube is visible or implied, things like that. And then, of course, because in this case he's cutting the corners, both corners, lower left and upper right, it does create a certain, what we like to call edge tension. What is going on the edges? And you have to really think about that when you look at Paul's work. Remember, I'm sure you know that when Matisse worked on his cutouts, the phrase that came up by critics was that he was cutting into color. He was cutting color, literally with scissors, cutting color. And that whole idea certainly applied to, appealed to Paul. those cutouts were of course handmade and hand cut. And when Matisse pasted them on the surface, you could see certain places where things were a little bit ragged or something didn't kind of mesh with something else. He was not in the greatest health at that time. He was working from a wheelchair. But the point of that is important because when you look at these paintings these cutouts from a distance, they seem like perfect. And then you get close and you see, oh, wait a minute, this, he didn't cut that and this doesn't fit. And there are some places in Paul's work where you have to really look closely to where the edges are. And to that extent, the colleague that I had, that I asked very kindly to write the chapter of the catalog on staining, she's a specialist on staining, she goes into Paul's work in great detail and looks at the edges and how things bleed, etc. And her essay is, I think, a very important one. Paul's work has been discussed. That aspect has been discussed, but not the way that Hannah, her name is Hannah DeCourt, not the way that she deals with it in the catalog. So here you see everything is thought out. One of the most iconic series is the disc series here on the left, number 3A from 1965, which resides here, as does the study from 1965. Probably, maybe next to the mandala paintings, the disc paintings are the most familiar to people if they know anything about Paul's art. They were begun in 1964. He did a small series of sketches for these work. He did some 40 sketches, small scale sketches, when he was trying to work out what he was hoping to sort of create here. And the paintings can work horizontally or vertically. And this is another interesting point. Sometimes Paul really didn't care the way he hung the painting. And that opens up a new way of thinking about the paintings. These paintings can range in size to about 7 by 9 feet. So he wasn't afraid of scale. And the discs were included in that landmark exhibition in D.C. One of the critics for the Washington Post at that time was Elizabeth Stevens, and she attended that exhibition, and she wrote, quote, "The smoothly brushed backgrounds and the wedge-shaped areas in the upper right and lower left corners are unmixable colors created by superimposing one layer of transparent acrylic on a lower layer that has already dried." It sounds a little bit technical, but when you really think about what she's saying, you can sort of see it here. In this talk, I'm not talking about the invention of magna and the paints. That'll be my next talk, where we'll get into that kind of what made those paints so special and how they sort of led to this idea of staining. So certainly, as I've said, Paul was well read. And what's important to keep in mind about Paul also, and it's not always true for artists, he was a teacher. He was a professor. He taught at the Corcoran through most of the 70s. In other words, he had to know. You never learn as much about your material as you do if you have to teach it, because you don't want to embarrass yourself. So you're up all night making sure everything is the way it should be. So Paul was an educator. He was a teacher. And he was interested in earlier and even contemporary sources. Most especially, obviously, for his work would be Mondrian, Pete Mondrian, and Joseph Albers. So I've juxtaposed here just a couple of things. That's a small Paul Reeve study that's from Georgetown on the upper left. It just goes by, the title is just its date, 3/1/66. And then the Mondrian on the right is the last, it's actually an unfinished study that he did for the painting New York City, and it dates to 1941. What's interesting in both of those paintings is that both artists are using colored tape. And Mondrian began to experiment with scale and shape and color and linear aspects by using tape. Paul very often used tape in these small studies. On the lower left is a work by Paul, and that's 12/23/66. 64, from 1964. And we have Alper's study it's a study for the series of paintings he called Homage to the Square from 1961. So it's interesting because you have to think, when you think about the surface of a painting, especially if you haven't touched it yet, it's pretty intimidating. It's like if you're a writer and you look at that blank page and you start freaking out. So thinking about how that surface is going to work, is it going to pulsate, is it going to work in and out, left and right, all of that is very important. And Paul was up on all of the historical theories of color, especially in the 19th century, but even extending back to Isaac Newton and Goethe, he was familiar with all of those. In his notes here at the archive here when I was going through, which you hold here, there is a little sketch that he labeled Newton's color wheel. So he was really thinking about ways in the past that artists have thought about color. And maybe this is a painting, and it's why I thought it should be on the cover of the catalog, because in just one painting, I was trying to pick something that was representative of everything that kind of was at the base of Paul Reed's art. And this painting has it all. First of all, it has diagonal rhythm, diagonal cut from the upper left to the lower right. The corners are cropped. The white part of the painting is unstained. The rest of the painting is stained painting using a brush, usually on a roller, which you see here on the right. He had rollers varied from about 3 inches to actually the size of a roller you would use to paint your house. And he used them in different ways. Now, again, these are water-based acrylics, so it's an emulsion in water. It acts somewhat like a watercolor paint in general. It's not oil-based, so it's very translucent, and you have to, of course, calculate how it's going to be when it dries, because when it goes on, it's one color when it's wet, but then it's going to be different color when it dries. And so he has to think about all of the sort of dynamics of how color behaves and how that paint is going to be absorbed into the canvas, and yet still have its sort of integrity held for our eyes. And you have to be careful about letting things dry too quickly. And this painting, he's actually painting wet on wet. He's trying to avoid having the first layer dry before he comes back with the second layer. Now, I mentioned that Paul was a student of art history and obviously the New York School. He spent time in New York. He hung out, let's say he visited the Cedar Bar, which was the hangout for the abstract expressionists. The first exhibition that was done at the Washington Gallery of Modern Art was a memorial exhibition for Franz Klein. So he was definitely aware. He had met Franz Klein and a number of the other artists. So on top is a paint that is called the Upstart series. Paul worked like Matisse. He worked in series. And when you have an artist who works in series, usually what they do and why they like to work in a series is because they're going to just set up, these are the problems I want to try to solve in this series. And they stay at it and repeat and repeat. That's why you have all those Mondrians, et cetera, and all those Paul Reeds, quite frankly, where he's just hitting the same note, but he's varying it and seeing different problems. Then the artist feels like, okay, I think that's enough. I think I've said everything I can say about that. And now what's going to happen next? And usually it's a very organic process because something in the previous series has indicated to him what the next series will be. So the painting here on the top is Coherence from 1966, Coherence number 16. And that's Jackson Pollock, I'm sure you know, on the bottom, Blue Poles from 1952. And Paul said that when he had looked at Blue Poles by Pollock, it's when he began to get the idea of this kind of cadence that went across the surface, these very linear, this cadence. And that in actuality, that was sort of the inspiration for moving to that idea in his own painting. Of course, he totally was uninterested in the painterly, personal kind of angst and all of that the abstract expressionists were known for. It's a much more crisp, hard-edged kind of painting that has certain rhythms and color relationships that you have to look at, especially when the color bands cover over each other. When one color comes over another color, you have to see what's happening there. It is work, and I'll come to that in a second, that seems to have something to do with minimalism at the time, most specifically Donald Judd. And I'll show you that in a second. But it also has other things. He begins to become interested in cadence, in rhythm, in kind of a musical idea. I think his paintings are very musical. They have a counterpoint that you have to look at and see. They're like chords versus notes. This is both whether something has a vertical ascendancy or a horizontal progression, kind of a synchronic versus diachronic, something that's right there in the moment, but also something that implies movement in a different direction. And this is all part of a probing mind. Paul was curious. And a great gift for any artist is to be curious and to just want to learn everything about everything and somehow incorporate that into one's art. So you do see references in his work to mathematics, certainly to geometry, to Renaissance theories of geometry, to music, even Gregorian chant, how notes look when you look at a page and see how the notes work across the staff. Certainly physics he was very interested in, especially late in life. So here is Paul against Donald Judd. And this is a Donald Judd sculpture on the left from 1968. It's untitled, but it's part of a series that Judd referred to as the stacks, because he stacks these sort of aluminum, it depends on what it is, steel, aluminum forms on top of each other. And in this case, it's a 10-piece. It's like getting chicken. You can get, I just want the 6-piece, I'll just have the 8-piece. This is the 10-piece from top to bottom. It's a stepped gradient of color, usually from light to dark, moving from top to bottom. It's evocative of all kinds of things. Certainly it's evocative of ladders, skyscrapers, piano keys. Judd was, again, Judd is great. I don't want to give a lecture on Judd, but he was able to take what appeared to be a very simple vocabulary, but constantly sort of reinvent it. What's interesting is the painting on the right is the one from our collection at the National Gallery of Art. And that's Coherence, just titled Coherence with no number, from 1966. And I think you can see sort of the similarity. It's interesting that when Paul had a show at East Hampton Gallery in New York City, Donald Judd was actually a part-time critic at that time. He was writing reviews. And he wrote about that review, about that work, and he was not particularly complimentary. And the only thing you have to know is Judd wrote a very important kind of, not really, like a manifesto. It was called Specific Objects in 1964, where he kind of laid out all of his thoughts. And in that treatise, he said, quote, actual space is intrinsically more powerful and specific than paint on a flat surface. That pretty much kills Paul Reed, because his paintings, although they certainly have optical properties, but of course he is putting paint on a flat surface. And Paul was asked about that when he was alive. He was interviewed at the National Archives, the Archives of American Art, and he was actually asked about Donald Judd, and he was asked about that review, and Paul said, quote, the review was small and not complimentary. Of course, when you know Judd's philosophy, you have what you expect from him. And then he goes on to say, you didn't need all that stuff on there. That's sort of Judd. You can strip it down. I was influenced by Judd in the sculpture, the early 60s sculpture, the so-called minimalist sculpture. So he has this relationship with Donald Judd, sort of on and off, shall we say. Paul was a sculptor. And again, we tried in the exhibition to show you the range of his work. Paul's work is best known certainly by the decade of the 1960s, but he was curious and always pushing himself, experimenting with different materials, right up to the end when he's working with computer imagery. This is just a little collection of the sculptures. These are beautifully displayed in the exhibition. The one on the left is untitled from 67. The sectional one is Mercury from 67, and then Step on the right from 66. So the Step sculpture certainly, again, kind of comes back to Donald Judd in some ways, although with a different idea of how those stacked forms are open across the surface. The interesting sculpture, the one that I really like, is the one in the center, Mercury, where he has to bend this piece of steel. And what he was interested in there, and he spoke about that, was a sculpture actually by Auguste Rodin. It's the Isis Messenger of the Gods. It's a female torso that rests on one point. Her leg is just one point and the other leg is out. And he was fascinated with that kind of movement. He was interested, the subject Mercury, of course, the Greek and Roman god, Hermes, Mercury. So he had that idea of the winged feet of the god and a sculpture of certain movement. Now, the welded sculpture, like the one on the right, the one thing Paul didn't know how to do was to weld. He never was interested in learning how to weld. So even though he admired David Smith greatly, and Smith was one of the great welders in American art, Paul didn't care about that. So he worked with a friend, Bill Truitt, who was a very good welder. And so what Paul would do with these sculptures is he would lay them out, work them out on paper, etc., working with Bill, who would then finally do the welding. Here's My Turn from 1967. It's interesting because color does play a role in his sculpture, and the idea of painted sculpture in the 40s and 50s and 60s was a big controversy with David Smith, for example, was always something that was being discussed. But this is wonderful because he cuts the pipe, Bill Truitt cuts the pipe lengthwise, which is interesting, and it opens up then like a kind of a shell, and it just is spot welded on that one place of contact. So here there's this beautiful balance, but also perhaps a little bit of tension. One side is hot, the other side is cool. So all of that is sort of there. He said, Paul, talking about sculpture, etc., he said, when he was asked about that influence, he said, quote, "I don't know, the things that Smith and Judd were doing, it seemed to me to lock into the paintings." In other words, when he looked at Judd and David Smith, what locked into his head was how that form might look as a painting, sort of the reverse of what a lot of artists were thinking about. So we go through this incredible series. This is Intersection on the left from 1966, Interchange on the right. You notice these titles, Intersection, Interchange. Very often they do have a kind of modern reference to the idea of highways and byways, crisscrossing. This was true with de Kooning. De Kooning never owned a car. And when he would go out into the country, he couldn't drive, so he would just stick his head out the window like a dog. And he was just like fascinated by all these. He had come from Holland, and so he was just fascinated. So a lot of his paintings, like he has a painting called Interchange, and others are sort of cityscapes. That's true with Paul, but Paul is much more obviously logical, and these are paintings, whether they're the horizontal vertical or the zigzag form here, create a new set of problems or issues. The zigzag paintings are especially interesting because they imply going beyond the boundary of the frame or the edge, that this could be a form that goes on well beyond. This was something, again, that was actually important to Mondrian. On the edges, does it look like it could just go out forever? But he made a conscious decision in 66, 67 to move away from the disc forms, the curvilinear forms, the mandala forms, and to go work that was much more geometric, but also had some action. And in fact, the painting on the right, in Paul's mind, he was actually thinking of Franz Klein, the way Franz Klein would put these beautiful black strokes down, and they would just go off the edge, that kind of thing. The shaped canvases are among the most beautiful. Sometimes people don't like to hear that word beautiful in contemporary art. They think it's some kind of somebody wasn't really working hard. But these are paintings the shaped paintings are magnificent. And they take different forms, different numbers of sides. This is Emmer Top B on the left from 1967. And then a study in the center from Georgetown, a pencil on paper study for Topeka, which is on the right. That is Topeka on the right that you have here in Oklahoma. So again, he's thinking of a pentagon shape. He goes through this whole, three shapes, three sides, four sides, five sides, six sides, and how is that going to affect the way the color and the space and the way he lays things down, especially in the Emmertop series on the left. It's the way the paint comes over the paint. Those strips that keep coming back over each other. The other thing to keep in mind, and it's sometimes obvious, but people miss it, is that he's fascinated with putting paintings on the point. And this is very important. When you put a painting on a point, and this came from Rodin, from that sculpture I mentioned, you put something on a point, and it can teeter one way or the other, and then to hold that painting on a point in a kind of sort of stable relationship. One of the things that Paul writes about, especially in his class notes that I looked at, is that he was always saying, you've got to find the central axis in my painting, because it might not be down the middle. There's going to be an important axis somewhere that's going to help you understand how everything else sort of fits together. So again, the Emmertop is a strange name. I don't think that one's a misspelling because he did a number of them. And I think it relates in part to the idea of the emerging top, the things on the top that seem to be emerging outwards and upwards. These are some of the other great shaped paintings. This is Marmara number 3 and Barcelona number 4 from 68 and 69. These belong here in your permanent collection. So after the Upstart series, you can almost sense that he's thinking, well, what if I do move those bands off the surface or begin to imply a certain spatial relationship? So he called these paintings his geometric abstractions. They're certainly among his finest works. You're very fortunate to have some of the best examples. So there are works from the series called Emerging, Topeka, Hackensack, Ziegfeld, Barcelona. Now, the name Marmara, which he uses for a number of paintings, is interesting, and that is actually a small inland sea in Turkey, so it is a location that you can track down. And he talked about the Marmara paintings. He said, quote, "As I looked at the Marmara paintings, they seemed to change from surface to deep open space. So what was especially important in these paintings, and sometimes they have a blue kind of streak here that almost looks like a pool of water on a surface, and then a white, of course, the way the edges work. And you have to, when you look at a Reed painting, you actually have to count pretty carefully because you may miss a lot of sides. For example, This painting looks like it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Actually, it has 15 size because you have to count what's going on inside as well. So within this now sort of shaped canvas and now beginning, in fact, to work large scale. Paul could only work large scale when he had a large studio. Eventually, he lost the studio in the 70s and he was basically working from home. So his work had to sort of shrink. But that's not the case here. This is Hackensack on the left from 1967. And if you haven't been to the exhibition yet, that's 14 feet high. It's magnificent. And then on the right, an equally magnificent painting is Ziegfeld A from 1967. He could tackle large-scale painting. In fact, I just received an email from a sculptor, a friend of mine, who's kind of like the modern David Smith. And he was interested in the exhibition. And then there was a little online, you can find a 40-second video of the installations crew here putting up Hackensack. It only lasts for 40 seconds. But when he saw that, he was like bowled over the size of the painting, the scale of the painting. So Paul is versatile. And the other thing related to these two pictures is that, in essence, Paul would not object to hanging Hackensack horizontally. And you kind of sense that when you look at the comparison between Hackensack and Ziegfeld. And each time the painting turns a certain way, you get another set of interesting relationships. Here is Ziegfeld at the left, where it resides at the art gallery at College Park at the University of Maryland. And that was a Maryland exhibition they did on Paul at the left, and that's Ziegfeld. And then this is on the right, not a sculpture, it's a print. It's a screen print that we have at the National Gallery. And you notice it goes the other way. It's basically the same work, but it goes one way and another way, depending. Here it is in storage at the University of Maryland. And when you look at that, if you look at that 40-second video, it shows them uncrating this painting. I have to say, everybody here involved with this exhibition, everybody from curatorial to design, installation, graphic design, did a magnificent job. This is a magnificent exhibition. And this will be the record. This will be the touchstone now for Paul Reed studies going forward. But this installation, this exhibition is going to travel to 2 other venues, but it's not going to look as good as it looks here. So it's just an incredible accomplishment. And again, I thank everybody. So here is Step, which is this is one of my favorite Paul Reeds. And on the right, what he's doing, because this is so important, are all of these test strips. You have to figure out, okay, well, what if I do put this color over that color? And so you do a little, you keep doing these little test runs here. And that's what he's doing there on the right. And here is Safed number 6 on the right. And then that photo that's also enlarged in the exhibition from 1970. Again, all those photos are pretty much from the 70s. So his subject is color, but his formats are geometric. They're all over compositions. He's looking at 3D versus 2 dimensions. All of these things, multi-sided compositions. Now, Safed here is interesting because it has actually, it's not a misspelling. Well, it's a different spelling. In Persian, Safed is spelled S-A-F-E-D, not I-D. And that, in Persian, that pertains to something that is white or kind of silvery. But Safed also refers to a city in Israel. It was the highest point, the highest city in the Galilee area. It was a fortified town. And so very often you sense, I think that's the relevant thing here. He's thinking about this fortified kind of town almost here. So I think, I don't know, but I think there when he spells Safed with an E, I think he's probably just misspelling it. Because every other thing that it refers to usually is spelled with an I, although, one doesn't know. He might have just been playing with us. So here is the satellite painting I brought back. That's at Wigmore Fine Art in New York. And then here's the Gilport series on the right, a series that begins in the 70s. This is Gilport CC, III, they're all Roman numerals. And here he now begins to explore that space that I mentioned earlier that was kind of nascent in the satellite picture. Now it's becoming very important. This is a painting that is not stretched. It's not on a frame or a stretcher. It's just the canvas, and the canvas has to be tacked to the wall. And when you look at the back sides of these pieces, he gives very specific instructions about how it should be placed and what the distance should be between the two halves. So in the past, they've been thumbtacked. Here, it was not gratefully they decided to use magnets instead, because you can only put a pinprick in it so many times, and all of a sudden you can drive a truck through it. There's a beautiful cold geometry in the center, and you have to figure and calculate, if you brought this together, what is the size of this square here, or rectangle? And what this piece compared to the gap, and then the fact that it has this many sides, and it's in a certain way it's bifocal. We have two eyes, and with our eyes you can't always see something in its entirety at a glance. And so this actually is a painting that has a kind of relationship to the way that we see in terms of being bifocal. So he's engaged with the wall here again, with the space of the wall. And there's a nice dialogue between the hard edge shape of that rectangle and then this beautiful kind of diaphanous, amorphous kind of blue that you see. Getting into the 80s, on the left is, again, just the title is a number, 8/30/84/1 from 1984. And then a work from the Phillips collection on the right, it's untitled, from 1986. When he starts working smaller, when he's home, he's working out of his house, and he has to really start reducing everything and do works that are small scale. He turns to pastels, he turns to gouache and to watercolor. The work on the right is, it's beautiful. To me, it doesn't even look like it's opaque watercolor. It looks like it's a crayon, Conte crayon, this beautiful oily kind of crayon. But it is opaque watercolor on paper. It's luscious. It has a luscious kind of surface. On the left is interesting because for a time in the 80s, he used stencils. So he cut out, stencil shapes like you're going to make Christmas cookies. And he kind of put them together and flattened them and treated them in different ways on the surface. And this one here is particularly interesting because it has these kind of claw-like shapes and things, and these kind of crustacean-like forms that look somewhat threatening or somewhat, difficult. And that is certainly, again, he's aware of the way surrealists used things like that. Max Ernst specifically. Paul spent a lot of time in Arizona. He was invited to be an artist in residence at Arizona State University in Tempe, and then artist in residence at the Phoenix Art Museum. And at ASU, he got to meet the master printer. ASU had a very, very important and very innovative print research facility, and it had been founded by Joe Segura along with Jules Heller, who at that time was the dean of the College of Fine Arts. The ironic thing about my story with Paul is I was at Arizona State at the same time he was, but we actually never met at that time. In any case, when Paul began to work with Segura, his variations and ideas and imagination, because Segura just showed him all kinds of techniques for printmaking. And that would be the same for his relationship with the DC artist Lou Stovall. Lou had a very close relationship with Paul. And so he had these two great master printers that he had worked with in DC and in Arizona. Photography and collage. This is Phoenix Rialto, 1982. On the left, it's a photo collage, and then this is 5/26/86/4 on the right, gouache and paper with collage. He spent a lot of time in the West, visited Arizona, California, other places, and you can pretty much always pick out where he is. There's one of these collages that shows a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown in Los Angeles, and this is the Salt River down here. That's in Tempe. That is almost dry all the year. It's a dry riverbed until it floods. So here again, he's feeling that he wants to pull in now the real world with the abstract world, things that come from nature, things that we can look at and see and understand, and make these interesting kinds of collage juxtapositions. This is alpha number 12 on the left and row number 10 on the right. In the 90s, he goes back to acrylic painting. And now, though, he adds a new technique, and that is scraping, putting down a thick layer of paint and then taking a kind of plastic spatula and creating these grooves that you see here. It's interesting, of course, when we talk about great scrapers, Willem de Kooning is like one of the greatest. This guy would scrape things on and off like 100 times. But it's interesting here is that he's turned the painting now on the point again, and it's like a diamond shape. And this is exactly what Mondrian did late in his career. He began to shift the paintings and then play with what he used to call cutting, in terms of what was happening along the edges. Yet another series that relates to these slats or boards or rafts. They've been described in numerous different ways: flags, sails, rafts, slats. What he started with here is work that we've lost, unless Gene can find it. And these were like mobiles. He had these wooden slats tied together that were mobiles, and then he would just hang them in the house. I don't think any of that work has survived, but that carried over into the paintings here, where he creates this kind of, again, form. And I chose particularly this one here because it's black and white with these lines, because what inspired this series was the sleeve on the woman painted by Renoir in the painting called The Loge. If you know that painting from 1874, she's in a loge and she's got this big puffy sleeve that has black and white stripes, and that kind of stuck in his mind. On the right, and again, here he's certainly dealing with perspective. At first, you might think those lines are parallel, but they're not parallel. Somewhere in the universe, they will touch. And then on the right is Bofedora from 1980. Well, the title is Bofedora 84, but it was created in this print in 2003. He began to take photographs and come back to photographs and then superimpose this form that he'd been dealing with earlier. Now here, I think he's not. I sound really like a schoolmarm, but here he's misspelled. Bofedora, Bofodora, means nothing, but Bufadoro, Bufadora, is this very famous marine geyser that's in the Punta Banda Peninsula in Baja California. And he went to California, so I think here he just got lazy. Which, artists do, especially if you're cranking out this body of work. Now, it's, again, coming back to this installation, to this exhibition, these are the muslin works, acrylic on muslin, and when I would visit him and he had these works, he would normally hang them in his windows, and so you'd get this kind of Matisse chapel effect, or a Rothko chapel, or Ellsworth Kelly, and they were just muslin. They were loose. They weren't fixed on any support. So the wind would blow and they would wave. And what was particularly of interest to him was the fact that you could look at one of these muslin paintings that might have like a tree form or something, and you could see through it into the landscape around his house that had those trees, so things like that. So there was an interesting thing going on here. So this kind of almost environmental now, he's interested in kind of, in his house at least, creating a small domestic environment. Does relate to Monet, to Matisse, to Rothko, Ellsworth Kelly. And one has to decide how to exhibit these works because they do need light. And the solution here at Oklahoma is just magnificent. They actually built light boxes and put these in, and there's a little button that you'll push to illuminate the light. Now, I mentioned that late in Paul's life, he really got involved with physics. And this is boson number 2 from 2014, a year before he died, from the Phillips collection. And then one of his strangest paintings is the painting on the right, which has a strange title, 73% Solution 2. That's the title, from 2014. Now, the boson, he became fixated on the idea of a boson, and this is when he was involved in this very important friendship with a physicist from NASA in Virginia. And they would have lunch, and Paul and this physicist would talk. And Paul just had like a million questions about quantum mechanics, physics, particles, etc. And so one of the most famous elements was what was called the Higgs boson. It's an unstable particle that's created in a collision, essentially, of particles. But the only way a physicist can know that it was a boson is you can't see a boson. All you can see is the detritus after it has collided. So you'll know it existed, but you're just looking at the detritus. And Paul took that as the subject. In essence, here he's trying to paint something you can't see. Nobody can see a boson. So this is his idea, and he did 4 paintings like this on that subject. The other painting, 73% Solution 2, he again had these conversations about what's called dark matter in physics, dark matter, and in learning about dark matter, it's kind of this form of invisible matter that makes up a huge part of the universe. The exact nature of dark matter isn't particularly understood. But in 2014, the scientific community did finally come up with a number, and that was 73% of the universe is made of matter that has not yet been discovered, hence it's dark. So that was genesis for this painting. In this painting, I mean, I could get carried away thinking about what Paul's really painting here and how it relates to his own personal life and his journey and all of that. But you can sort of make these connections on your own. And then finally, this was when we received Coherence as a donation, a gift to the gallery from Bill McGillicuddy, who also owns Ziegfeld A, that big painting. And we invited Paul to come to the gallery. This was January 19th, 2012. And we had a little unveiling sort of ceremony so he could see his painting that we had acquired. It's one of his best works. When we were thinking about acquiring work, Harry Cooper said to me, who was the curator of modern art, I said, I can get you a painting. And he said, well, it's got to have 3 things. It's got to be big, because the East Building eats up paintings at the National Gallery. It's got to be in perfect condition, and it has to be from the artist's most important period, in this case, the 60s. Just anecdotally, at one point I was standing with Paul and we were looking at the painting, just the 2 of us. And so I turned to him and I said, so what do you think? And he said, I can die a happy man. For him, having a painting at the National Gallery was like Valhalla. And it really did bother him that he wasn't in that collection, Gene Davis, everybody else is in that collection. Gene Davis, Marion, Downing, Morris Lewis, Kenneth Nolan, and he wasn't. And he was aware of that. And so for him, this was the ultimate. I'm in the National Gallery. I'm in the gallery I used to ride my bike to when I was a young boy with my friend Gene Davis. This exhibition is going to travel. It'll go to the Torgler Fine Arts Center that you see on the left in Newport News, Virginia. That'll end, as it should, in Washington, D.C., which was Paul's sort of hometown. And here's the last photograph of Paul in his house, surrounded by just a fraction of his paintings. This was a photograph from August 24th, 2014. I don't have time to wax poetic about why I think Paul is so important, but this exhibition, I think, sort of does the work for me. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any questions. Sorry for keeping you longer.
We have time for a few questions, and David will repeat the question for the
You mentioned the orientation of the thing. Say you didn't care if it was like personal.
Yeah, he loved experimenting with that. Many times he does. So there you know you got to play by the rules. When you look at the back, he was always writing on the back very, very specific instructions, and he'd have the arrow saying top and things like that. And then you have to kind of go by the rules. But in other cases he was, and even quite frankly, because I talked to him about that, quite frankly, even when he originally said that it should go this way, later he started thinking, well, maybe it would be interesting this way. Yeah. Other questions? Yep.
I'm an elementary art teacher. If I want to do a unit on Paul Reed, what tools do you use? Tape?
Right. First of all, kids love this kind of art. I mean, we have an educational system like you do, and when kids look at the DC Color School, and they're all on the floor, kind of in a semicircle looking. This is stuff they love. They have no prejudices about this abstraction or this or that. They just come with an open mind and open eyes. So Paul's materials were certainly a palette knife, traditional brushes. More importantly, were rollers that he wouldn't. And that's what I was showing you in that one photograph. Sometimes he used spray. He had a kind of kind of a thing that you use that. Some of the Marmara series has a kind of glitter on the top. There were some paintings where he was experimenting with glitter. Certainly his hands, just throwing stuff down. So basically traditional tools, I would say. Of course, scissors and cutting, X-Acto knives and all that stuff that, because he would create a model, especially for the three-dimensional ones, he would really have to experiment with. And that was all cutting, basically. You're welcome.
So you have the one comparison between Reed and Albers, and obviously I don't think anybody was obsessive about color studies as Albers was.
Right.
He didn't really ever go, Albers never went to the depth of geometry. What led Reed to move from color relationships to geometry?
Geometry. Yeah, well, I think partly that relates to what was actually happening in New York and DC at the time, which were these shaped kinds of paint. That was becoming sort of in vogue, you might say. The Albers thing is interesting because he did use Albers' theory of color, the book, as a text in his classes, for his advanced classes. So he would have excerpts from that book that he would discuss with the students. So I think, again, it's always curiosity and an interest in pushing things beyond. And so Alpers and Mondrian are for Paul. I think they're these kind of foundational artists but then he feels he can take their lessons and go in other ways. And I think the geometry, and then certainly minimalism. I mean, like Donald Judd. I mean, even though Judd thought that was kind of ridiculous. That thing should be three-dimensional, but certainly minimalism, yeah. Yeah, Eric.
About the residence of Paul Reed. When did he live in Washington all the time, or did he move?
No, actually, Gene knows more about it. They originally moved to Fairfax, Virginia, right? And then actually, early, he was living in the district when he was younger and had a studio that eventually he lost, and that was the big studio. He was teaching at the Corcoran. But basically, he was living in suburban Virginia, Fairfax, Arlington. His house is, that photograph there is his house in Arlington. And what he had done, it's very interesting because he had, the first time I walked into this house, I almost had a heart attack because I walked in and I was just surveying the rooms that I saw as I entered. And Esther, his wife, was still alive at that time. And in every nook and cranny, in every space, under the bed, in the cabinets, in the kitchen, in the upstairs, in the downstairs, were paintings rolled up. I have pictures, I didn't bring them. Nathan knows. Nathan has been the caretaker and does a tremendous job because we had a kind of a similar experience when Maury and I went to California to look at a storage unit that they keep, and that was like, again, it was like, oh my God. And then later we were getting ready to leave, and then Nathan said, I have another storage unit. And I said, oh, you got to be kidding. So he was prolific, and actually I'm somewhat concerned about that. I'm concerned about those paintings and what's going to happen, and the family has to discuss things, and that's their patrimony, and so, but it is a huge body of work, yeah. Other questions? Yeah, in the back.
Now, what would you say accounts for the fact that amongst the Washington Color School, that Gene Davis and, of course, Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan really flourished much more than Paul?
Yeah, that's a great question. That always comes up. In relationship with Gene Davis to Paul Reed, and I talked to people at the museum earlier today about this, Gene Davis was like a social butterfly. He went to everything, every opening, everything. I mean, he was there he was the court jester almost. He was very popular. He promoted his art. He became DC, and at a certain time really thought of itself as the real Gene Davis, sort of. He got to stripe out the streets, all of this. And Paul was just the opposite. Paul was more reticent. He didn't like the business of art, and unfortunately, even in the 40s and 50s, and especially today, an artist has to be a businessman too, or a business person. And Paul wasn't, he was short-tempered. He could be cranky. And if he didn't like you were out. You weren't coming back. So I think that to a large extent it was that. That doesn't maybe do full justice to the situation. Certainly Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan, they were the two initially promoted by Clement Greenberg, because it was Greenberg who told those two to go to New York to see the work of Helen Frankenthaler, and she was staining. This is my next talk. And so when they went to New York, they went to Helen Frankenthaler's studio. They saw the painting she was working on, which we now have at the National Gallery, called Mountains and Sea. And she was staining, putting the canvas on the floor and just pouring paint out. And then Clement Greenberg really did champion Louis and Nolan. And I think he championed Nolan because he probably had other interest in Kenneth Nolan, but we won't go into that. He had one of Nolan's target paintings over his desk. So every day when Clement Greenberg sat down to write, he was looking at that Kenneth Nolan target. Morris Louis is fascinating because he dies young, and in the next talk I'll show you his house. You can go by his house today. And the reason his paintings were of a certain size is because he painted at home, and the painting had to fit in the dining room or the bedroom. So that determined the scale when he laid the canvas out. And it was fascinating because this, like Mondrian, Morris Louis didn't drop a drop of paint on the floor. He painted like in a tie, in a suit, like Mondrian. He didn't really have a studio, but his wife was a school teacher, and she'd go away for the day, and he would paint all day. By the end of the day, he would be sitting on the steps waiting for her to come back. And she'd ask, "So what did you do today?" And he'd show her. But it wasn't like, "Oh my God, what did you do to this place? There's paint all over the wall." No, it was like he was very controlled in that regard. But he died tragically young. Yeah. Other.
Mentioned your relationship with Paul, because you mentioned he was your friend.
Right.
How did you meet him and what did you...
I met Paul in 2010. In 2010, Gene had very generously given a number of his many are in the exhibition, small studies that had actually been hanging in the bedroom of his house, because I saw them when he had them all on the wall in the bedroom. And that work she donated to Georgetown University, to the library at Georgetown. And when that first donation came through, there was Georgetown wanted to do something to sort of commemorate that gift and whatnot. So they had a little symposium, and they invited people who he had worked with, but Lou Stovall was there and other people who were still alive. And they were looking for somebody to write sort of just a general little essay type thing for the brochure that they were going to have. And my name cropped up somewhere, and I was approached to do that. And that started my relationship with Paul. And then I would go frequently. Esther was still alive. By the end of Paul's life, he too was almost totally blind. I mean, he was losing his eyesight. And I didn't even realize that, because in his house, he just functioned like he knew where everything was. He didn't spill anything or hit the wall or anything. He just had learned the space of that house. We would always have cocktails at 4:00. And we just talked, and I talked, and I talked, and he talked, and he loved to talk if he thought you were worth talking with. And then there were a number of other smaller exhibitions that came about, and I was always involved in those. And I had always thought that a retrospective was definitely needed. This is a late. I mean, it's a wonderful exhibition. It's sort of sad that Paul can't be here to actually see it, because he's the last of that group to get a retrospective of this size with a catalog that's going to be the scholarly record for any scholar in the future starting to work on Paul Reed will certainly have to come here. And we'll have to look at that catalog. So we just had a friendship that kind of went through. He left Virginia or D.C. I might not have the years right, but he went to Arizona. He died in Phoenix in 2015, so he had left. And at when he was getting ready to leave, there were a number of artists and people. We gave him a kind of a banquet type thing. It was like the banquet Picasso gave for Rousseau. All these people came. And then he moved on to Arizona. And the ironic thing is, I don't know if it's karma or whatever, I did my undergraduate work at Arizona State University, and then I did my master's degree at Arizona State University. And I was there in the 70s, the very same decade, and I was an art history and history double major. So I was in the building all the time when Paul was there, and we never met. Yeah, we never met. Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to stop there for tonight, but David will be back Friday for our members preview. You're all invited Friday. If you haven't had a chance, please go up to the galleries, and the exhibition opens to the public on the 22nd. So thank you all, and thank you, David.